George Russell just did something in China that nobody expected. He took the fastest lap of sprint qualifying. And the time difference to Max Verstappen was shocking. More than 1.5 seconds. In modern Formula One, that is not a small gap. That is a warning. Because while Mercedes celebrated pole position, something very strange was happening inside the Red Bull garage. Max Verstappen climbed out of the RB22, looked at the engineers, and immediately started pointing at the car. Not the setup. Not the tires. The car itself. And what he showed in that moment is now raising a serious question across the paddock. Is the Ford-powered RB22 already in trouble at the second race of the season? Because the numbers from Shanghai are brutal. Verstappen only 8th. Hadjar 10th. Both Red Bulls more than 1.7 seconds away from Russell's pole lap. That kind of gap does not happen by accident. Especially not to a reigning champion team. And when engineers started looking at the telemetry, they noticed something even more worrying. Moments where the Red Bull suddenly loses power on the straights. Moments where the energy system stops delivering performance. Moments where the car simply cannot keep up. But here is the detail almost nobody noticed. Verstappen knew it before anyone else. He showed it the second he stepped out of the car. And if what he pointed at inside that RB22 is really the problem, then the entire 2026 season could change starting right here in China. What happened in that qualifying session did not start in the final lap. It started much earlier. Long before the checkered flag. Because if you look carefully at the entire session, Red Bull was already in survival mode from the very beginning. SQ1 started. And immediately the timing screens showed something unusual. Mercedes at the top. McLaren very close. Ferrari hovering around the top group. But the Red Bulls, nowhere near the front. Max Verstappen was not fighting for the fastest time. He was fighting to stay inside the safe zone. And that is something we almost never see. In fact, when the first segment ended, Red Bull had only barely escaped elimination. Less than 1/10 of a second separated them from being knocked out early. Think about what that means. The reigning champion team, almost eliminated in the very first round of sprint qualifying. But here is where things get even more interesting. Because at that exact moment, engineers across the paddock started paying attention. Not to the lap time, but to the sector times. And the pattern was strange. In the slow corners, the Red Bull looked acceptable. Not dominant, but competitive. Then the cars reached the long straight in Shanghai. And suddenly the lap time disappeared. Huge chunks of time lost in a matter of seconds. And this is where the real alarm bells started ringing. Because Shanghai is famous for one thing. The longest full throttle section of the season. A place where energy deployment is absolutely critical. If your hybrid system works perfectly, you gain speed all the way down the straight. But if something is wrong, the car runs out of electrical energy. And when that happens, the speed advantage simply vanishes. Drivers call this clipping. And it is one of the most frustrating sensations inside a Formula One car. You press the throttle. But the power you expect is not there. And suddenly the cars around you are flying past. Now remember this detail. Because a few minutes later, something happened that confirmed the suspicion. SQ2 began. And once again, Verstappen looked uncomfortable. The car was moving more than usual through the corners. Small corrections on the steering wheel. Tiny moments where the rear looked unstable. Nothing dramatic. But enough to show the driver was fighting the machine. Yet somehow, Verstappen dragged the car into SQ3. Barely. Again by less than 1/10 of a second. And this is where the tension inside the Red Bull garage reached another level. Because reaching the final segment was not the victory. The real question was simple. Did they have enough performance left for one final lap? Or had the RB22 already reached its limit? The engineers sent Verstappen out for the last attempt. Fresh tires. Clean track. Everything prepared for the fastest lap possible. But the moment he started the run, something felt different. Through the opening corners, the lap looked decent. Not spectacular, but competitive enough to challenge the top 6. Then came the long back straight of Shanghai. And this is where everything changed. The Red Bull suddenly looked slow. Not slightly slower. Visibly slower. Cars behind were gaining rapidly. And the timing sector immediately confirmed it. Massive time lost before the final braking zone. At that moment, Verstappen already knew. This lap was not going to be enough. But the real story was not the position on the grid. The real story was what the telemetry was already showing inside the garage. Because the data suggested the car was running out of deployable energy much earlier than its rivals. Which would explain everything. The speed deficit. The strange power delivery. And the frustration Verstappen showed when he climbed out of the car. But here is the part that almost nobody realized yet. If this problem is real, it does not only affect qualifying. It affects the entire race weekend. Because tomorrow's sprint race will be held on the exact same track. With the exact same long straights. Which means one question is now hanging over the entire paddock. Can the RB22 actually defend itself in wheel-to-wheel racing? Or will the Ford-powered Red Bull become an easy target on the straights? And the answer to that question may already be hidden in something that happened one race earlier. In Australia. Because the warning signs might have started there. Australia looked like a warning. But after what we just saw in China, it may have been the first real sign that something inside the RB22 is not working the way Red Bull expected. Because if you rewind the season only one race back, the story already looked strange. The weekend in Melbourne was chaotic for Red Bull. Max Verstappen started from the very back of the grid after a disastrous qualifying session. And yet, somehow, he managed to fight his way forward through the field. From 20th on the grid. All the way to 6th at the finish. On paper, that sounds impressive. And it was. But inside the team, the mood was not as positive as the result suggested. Because during that same race, the second Red Bull suddenly stopped. Isaac Hadjar's car suffered a catastrophic power unit failure. The engine simply exploded after only a handful of laps. That moment forced Red Bull engineers to start asking uncomfortable questions. Not about the chassis. Not about the aerodynamics. But about the brand new Ford power unit that now sits behind the driver. A completely new project. A completely new architecture. And a system that, until this season, had never been tested under real race pressure. Now here is the part most fans did not notice at the time. After that failure in Melbourne, the entire Red Bull approach changed. Engineers became more conservative. Energy deployment maps were adjusted. Power delivery became slightly more cautious. Because the last thing the team wanted was another explosion. And this is where the connection with China starts to become very interesting. Because if the team reduced the aggressiveness of the energy system to protect reliability, then something else inevitably happens. You lose performance. And in modern Formula 1, that loss shows up immediately on the straights. Exactly where the RB22 looked weakest in Shanghai. Exactly where Russell's Mercedes gained the most time. Which brings us back to that lap in sprint qualifying. The one that shocked the paddock. Russell's pole lap was not just quick. It was controlled. The Mercedes looked stable under braking. Smooth through the corners. And incredibly strong when the driver pressed the throttle on the straight. There was no visible clipping. No sudden drop in speed. Just constant acceleration. Meanwhile, Verstappen's Red Bull looked like it was fighting something invisible. Sometimes fast. Sometimes suddenly slow. Almost as if the car was deciding on its own when to deliver power. And that is exactly the type of behavior drivers describe when hybrid systems are not perfectly synchronized with the rest of the car. Now here is where the story becomes even bigger than just Red Bull. Because the entire 2026 regulation era was designed around these new hybrid systems. More electrical power. More energy recovery. More strategic deployment. In theory, this was supposed to create better racing. But in reality, it has created something very different. Drivers managing energy almost like a video game. Lifting off the throttle to recharge the battery. Saving power for the right moment. And sometimes slowing down dramatically in the middle of a straight just to regenerate energy. Fans have already started debating whether this is even real racing anymore. But for teams like Red Bull, the debate is much more technical. Because if their system is not harvesting and deploying energy as efficiently as Mercedes, then every straight becomes a disadvantage. Every qualifying lap becomes a risk. And every race becomes a defensive battle. But the most fascinating detail of all might be Max Verstappen himself. Because despite finishing 8th today, he did not sound defeated. He sounded analytical. Almost like a driver who already understands where the problem is. And that matters. Because Verstappen has spent years mastering cars that behave right on the edge. If anyone can extract performance from a difficult machine, it is him. Which raises a very uncomfortable possibility for the rest of the grid. What if the RB22 really is struggling right now? And Verstappen is still only 1 or 2 adjustments away from unlocking its potential? Because if that happens, the story of China changes again. And what looks like a disaster today could become something very different once Red Bull truly understands the car. But before that can happen, one critical test is about to arrive. The sprint race itself. And what happens there may reveal something even more dramatic about the RB22.